The old pickup truck rattled down the quiet country road, its engine groaning with every bump. Harold gripped the steering wheel firmly, his knuckles white against the faded leather. At 74, he wasn't as spry as he used to be, but driving still felt natural, almost comforting. The week-long trip to visit friends in a neighboring town had been pleasant enough, filled with laughter and reminiscing about days gone by. But now, as Harold turned onto the gravel path leading to his modest farmhouse, unease began to creep into his chest. Something was wrong. From a distance, the house looked the same, its peeling paint and sagging roof familiar, yet oddly unsettling, today. As Harold parked the truck near the porch, his sharp eyes caught something unusual. The front door stood slightly ajar. A cold breeze swept through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and decay. Harold frowned. He always locked the door before leaving, no matter how short the trip. His heart started to race, though he tried to brush it off. Maybe Ethan had forgotten to latch it properly when he came over last weekend. Ethan. The thought of his grandson sent a jolt of worry coursing through him. Harold climbed out of the truck slowly, his joints protesting with each step. The crunch of gravel beneath his boots seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. He glanced around, scanning the yard for signs of life. Everything appeared normal. The chickens roosting lazily in their coop, the rusted tractor leaning against the barn. But there was an emptiness that gnawed at him. Where was Ethan? Hadn't they agreed he'd stay here while Harold was away? Harold reached the porch steps and froze. Glass shards glittered like tiny diamonds scattered across the wooden planks. His stomach churned. This wasn't just carelessness. This was destruction. Someone, or something, had forced their way inside. For a moment, fear paralyzed him. Then, steeling himself, he pushed open the creaky door wider. "Ethan," he called, his voice echoing through the silent house. "You here, boy?" No answer, just the hollow sound of his own voice bouncing off the walls. Harold stepped cautiously into the living room, his boots crunching on broken picture frames and splintered furniture. The place was a wreck. Chairs were overturned, curtains torn, down and papers littered the floor like confetti. It looked less like a home and more like a battlefield. Panic clawed at Harold's throat. What if Ethan wasn't safe? What if whoever did this was still here? He moved deeper into the house, calling out again. Each room he checked only deepened his dread. The kitchen cabinets hung open, their contents spilled across the countertops. In the hallway, a lamp lay shattered, its bulb blinking feebly in its socket. And then upstairs he heard it, a faint whimper barely audible over the pounding of his own heartbeat. Harold's breath hitched. Clutching the railing for support, he climbed the stairs one slow step at a time. The noise grew louder, clearer. It was coming from Ethan's room. Pushing the door open gently, Harold saw his grandson huddled in the far corner, clutching a baseball bat so tightly his knuckles were white. Ethan's face was streaked with dirt and tears, his wide eyes filled with terror. For a second, neither of them spoke. Harold's relief at finding Ethan alive warred with the burning need to understand what had happened. Whatever it wasn't over. Not yet. Harold's heart ached as he took in the sight of Ethan, trembling and pale, his young face marked by fear. The boy looked smaller somehow, like the weight of whatever had happened was crushing him. Harold knelt down slowly, ignoring the sharp protest in his knees, and reached out a hand. "Ethan," he said softly, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "It's okay now. I'm here." At first, Ethan didn't respond. His grip on the baseball bat remained firm, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting danger to leap out at any moment. Harold waited patiently, giving the boy time to process. Finally, Ethan swallowed hard and whispered, They came in, broke everything." "Who?" Harold asked gently, though his stomach tightened with dread. "What happened, son?" Ethan hesitated, his lower lip quivering. Then, in halting words, he began to explain. A group of men, 3 or 4, he wasn't sure, had burst into the house late last night while he was sleeping. They wore masks, their faces hidden behind dark, fabric, and they shouted questions he couldn't answer. One of them grabbed him roughly, demanding to know where it was. Ethan had no idea what they were talking about, but that didn't stop them from tearing the house apart. They kept yelling, Ethan said, his voice cracking. I tried to tell them I didn't know anything, but they wouldn't listen. They threw stuff everywhere, broke things. I thought they were going to hurt me. Harold felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm for Ethan's sake. Did they take anything? He asked, glancing around the chaotic room. Ethan shook his head. No, they just wrecked everything. And then they left. Just like that. He paused, looking up at Harold with tear-filled eyes. Why would they do this, Grandpa? What did they want? Harold didn't have an answer. Not yet. But the question gnawed at him. If these men weren't burglars looking for valuables, then what were they after? His gaze swept over the destruction again, taking in every detail. The overturned dresser drawers, the torn cushions, the shattered lamp. Whoever these intruders were, they hadn't been careless. This wasn't random vandalism. It was a calculated search. He turned back to Ethan, placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. You're safe now, he said firmly. We'll figure this out together. But even as he spoke, Harold's mind raced. He needed to assess the situation carefully. First, he checked Ethan for injuries, relieved to find only minor scrapes and bruises. Then he made sure the house was empty, moving cautiously through each room with the revolver tucked into the waistband of his jeans. Every creak of the floorboard set his nerves on edge, but the house was silent now, save for the occasional groan of settling wood. When he returned to Ethan's room, the boy was sitting on the edge of his bed, staring blankly at the mess. Harold sat beside him, his weathered hands clasped tightly together. Listen to me, he said, his tone serious but kind. This place isn't safe anymore. We need to leave soon. But before we go, I want you to think hard. Did they say anything else? Anything that might give us a clue about who they are or what they wanted? Ethan frowned, thinking back to the terrifying ordeal. One of them mentioned something about the old man hiding it, he murmured, and another said something about checking the woods. Harold's brow furrowed. The woods. That made sense. They bordered his property, dense and shadowy, perfect for concealing secrets. Whatever the intruders were searching for, it must be tied to the land itself. Perhaps someone had used his property without permission, leaving behind something valuable or dangerous. As much as Harold wanted to whisk Ethan away immediately, curiosity burned within him. This was his home, his sanctuary. He refused to let strangers invade it and leave unanswered questions in their wake. More importantly, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. If those men believed something was hidden here, they'd likely return. And next time they might not be so quick to leave. We're not running, Harold said finally, his voice resolute. Not until we know what's going on. Ethan looked up at him, startled. But Grandpa, they could come back. What if they won't hurt us, Harold interrupted, his tone firm. Not if we stay smart. Now, help me clean up what we can. We'll gather some supplies, lock the doors, and keep watch tonight. Tomorrow we'll start looking for answers. Though still frightened, Ethan nodded, drawing strength from his grandfather's unwavering determination. Together they began, picking up pieces of their shattered lives, unaware that the real mystery and danger was only beginning. The next morning the sun rose over the horizon, casting long shadows across the battered farmhouse. Harold stood on the porch, sipping a cup of strong black coffee as he surveyed the damage once more. The house looked like it had been through a war zone, but his focus wasn't on the broken furniture or shattered windows anymore. His mind was racing with possibilities. Why would anyone target his quiet, unassuming home? What could they possibly be searching for? Ethan emerged from inside, holding a backpack stuffed with essentials: flashlights, bottled water, snacks, and a first aid kit. He looked tired but determined, mirroring the resolve he saw in his grandfather's eyes. What's the plan? Ethan asked, trying to sound braver than he felt. Harold set down his coffee mug and turned to face him. We start by thinking things through, he said calmly. These men weren't ordinary thieves. If they were after valuables, they'd have taken the TV, your laptop, maybe even the cash in my desk drawer. But nothing's missing. That means they were looking for something specific. But what? Ethan pressed, frustration creeping into his voice. I don't even know what it is. Neither do I, Harold admitted. But we can look for clues. Someone must have left something behind that'll point us in the right direction. He gestured toward the woods at the edge of the property. You mentioned last night that one of them talked about checking the woods. Let's see if there's anything out there worth finding. Ethan hesitated, glancing nervously at the trees. The forest loomed large and foreboding, its thick canopy blocking out much of the sunlight. It wasn't just the unknown danger lurking. Within that made him uneasy. It was also the thought of stepping outside their comfort zone when everything already felt so uncertain. Are you sure this is a good idea? Ethan asked cautiously. What if those guys are still out there? They're not, Harold replied confidently, though he couldn't entirely dismiss the possibility. If they were close by, they would have come back last night. No, they're probably regrouping somewhere else, trying to figure out their next move. We need to act now while we have the upper hand. With that, Harold grabbed a sturdy walking stick leaning against the porch railing and motioned for Ethan to follow. They began their trek into the woods, moving carefully along an overgrown path that wound its way deeper into the wilderness. The air grew cooler under the shade of the towering trees, and the sounds of birds chirping provided a strange contrast to the tension hanging between them. As they walked, Harold kept his sharp gaze trained on the ground, scanning for anything unusual. After about 10 minutes, he stopped abruptly, pointing to something half buried in the dirt. Look here, he said, crouching down. Ethan joined him and saw faint tire tracks etched into the soft earth. They were fresh, likely made within the past day or two, and led further into the woods. Do you think those men drove through here? Ethan asked, his pulse quickening. It's possible, Harold muttered, running his fingers along the grooves. Someone didn't want to be seen coming onto our property. Maybe they parked farther away and used these trails to approach the house unnoticed. Standing up, Harold exchanged a meaningful glance with Ethan. This discovery confirmed his suspicions. Whoever had attacked their home knew the area well enough to cover their tracks. It wasn't random vandalism, it was calculated and deliberate. They continued following the trail, which eventually widened into a clearing. There, amidst the tangled roots and fallen leaves, they found scraps of fabric, caught on low-hanging branches, and discarded gloves lying carelessly on the ground. Harold picked up one of the gloves, examining it closely. It was worn and dirty, but there was no mistaking its purpose. It belonged to someone who didn't want to leave fingerprints behind. This confirms it, Harold said grimly. Whoever did this isn't playing around. They came prepared. Ethan swallowed hard, feeling a mix of fear and determination bubbling inside him. So what do we do now? He asked. Harold straightened up, his jaw set firmly. We keep going. Whatever they were after, it's tied to this place, and I'm not letting them win without a fight. For the first time since the ordeal began, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. His grandfather might be old, but he was far from helpless. Together they were ready to uncover the truth, even if it meant facing whatever dangers lay ahead. Harold's mind worked like a well-oiled machine as they stood in the clearing, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle before them, the discarded gloves, the tire tracks, the cryptic mention of the woods. It all pointed to one thing. Whoever had broken into their home wasn't just reckless. They were desperate. And desperation made people dangerous. Ethan shifted nervously, beside him, clutching the strap of his backpack tightly. What if we're walking into a trap? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What if they're waiting for us out here? Harold turned to face him, his expression calm but firm. That's a risk we have to take, he said. But listen to me carefully, we won't go in blind. We'll stay alert, stick together, and keep our wits about us. If something doesn't feel right, we turn back. Got it? Ethan nodded, though his wide eyes betrayed his lingering fear. Harold placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You've got more courage than you think, son. Trust yourself. And trust me. With that, Harold led the way deeper into the woods, moving slowly and deliberately. He knew the terrain better than most, having wandered these paths countless times over the years. The forest might seem impenetrable to outsiders, but to Harold, it was like an old friend, familiar, predictable, and full of secrets only he understood. As they ventured further, the air grew heavier, thick with the scent of damp leaves and moss. Birds chirped overhead, but their cheerful melodies felt distant, almost muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Every step revealed new signs of disturbance: broken twigs, flattened grass, and faint scuff marks on the dirt. Someone, or several someones, had been through here recently. After another 10 minutes of careful navigation, they stumbled upon something that sent a chill down both their spines. Tucked behind a cluster of dense bushes was an old, rusted generator partially hidden beneath a tarp. Its presence was jarring. It didn't belong here, not in this remote stretch of wilderness. Harold crouched down to inspect it, brushing away layers of dirt and grime. Beneath his touch, he noticed fresh oil stains glistening on the metal casing. "They've been using this place," Harold muttered under his breath. "And not too long ago?" Ethan frowned, peering over his shoulder. "Using it for what? This looks like junk." "It's not junk," Harold replied sharply, his tone betraying his growing unease. "Generators like this are used to power equipment or lights. Someone set up camp nearby and they don't want anyone finding out." The realization hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. These men weren't just trespassers. They were hiding something significant, something big enough to warrant tearing apart their home and leaving destruction in their wake. "We should call the police," Ethan suggested, his voice trembling. "This is getting too dangerous." Harold shook his head, rising to his feet. "Not yet," he said firmly. "We need proof first. Right now, all we have are guesses and suspicions. The authorities won't act unless we give them something concrete. Besides," he hesitated, glancing toward the denser part of the forest ahead, "I think we're close to finding whatever they're after." Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but Harold silenced him with a raised hand. "Stay close," he ordered. "And remember what I said. If anything feels wrong, we leave immediately." They pressed onward, following the trail until it opened up into another clearing. What they found there stopped them dead in their tracks. Nestled among the trees was a dilapidated cabin, its wooden walls warped and splintered with age. Smoke curled lazily from a makeshift chimney, and the faint hum of a generator could be heard in the distance. Through the grimy windows, shadows moved, people pacing back and forth inside. Harold's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. He grabbed Ethan by the arm and pulled him behind a nearby tree, shielding them from view. "This is it," he whispered, his voice low but steady. "This is where they're hiding." Ethan stared at the cabin, his breathing shallow. "What do we do now?" Harold's lips curved into a determined smile, though his eyes remained sharp and calculating. "Now," he said, "we make our move." Harold's mind raced as he crouched behind the tree, his eyes fixed on the dilapidated cabin. The faint glow of light seeping through the cracks in the walls and the muffled voices inside confirmed they were onto something big. Whoever these men were, they weren't just passing through. They had made this place their base, and Harold needed to figure out why. "Stay here," Harold whispered to Ethan, gripping his shoulder firmly. "Don't move until I come back for you." Ethan's eyes widened with panic. "Wait, what? You're not going in there alone?" "I'm not going in yet," Harold replied calmly, his voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. "But I need to get closer. If we're going to stop them, we have to know exactly what we're dealing with." Before Ethan could argue further, Harold slipped away silently, blending into the shadows like a ghost. Years of living off the land had taught him how to move without making a sound, his boots barely disturbing the dry leaves beneath him. He circled the cabin cautiously, keeping low and using the trees as cover. Every step was deliberate, every breath measured. His heart pounded in his chest, but his focus never wavered. As he approached the rear of the structure, Harold spotted something that sent a jolt of alarm through him, a pile of crates stacked haphazardly near the back door. Peering closer, he noticed labels printed on the sides, chemical symbols and warnings about hazardous materials. Whatever was inside those crates wasn't meant for casual use. This wasn't just a hideout, it was a storage site for something dangerous. Harold clenched his jaw, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. These men weren't just trespassers, they were criminals hiding illegal goods on his property. And if they thought they could get away with it, they were dead wrong. Returning to Ethan, Harold found the boy exactly where he'd left him, pale but resolute. "We've got trouble," Harold murmured, pulling Ethan deeper into the woods where they couldn't be overheard. "They're storing chemicals or something worse in there. That's why they came to the house. They must have thought we knew about it." Ethan swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly. "So, what do we do now?" Harold's eyes gleamed with determination. "We create distractions, make noise, draw them out one by one. If we can split them up, we'll have a better chance of figuring out who they are and stopping them." Using fallen branches, rocks, and anything else he could find, Harold began setting up makeshift traps along the perimeter of the clearing. He wedged sticks between tree roots to create tripwires and stacked logs in precarious positions, ready to tumble down at the slightest disturbance. It was crude but effective, enough to buy them time if things went south. When the preparations were complete, Harold handed Ethan a flashlight. "Take this and stay hidden," he instructed. "If anyone comes your way, shine the light directly at them and run. Lead them away from me, understand?" Ethan nodded, though fear still lingered in his expression. "Be careful, Grandpa." Harold gave him a reassuring nod before slipping back toward the cabin. Taking a deep breath, he grabbed a large rock and hurled it against the side of the building. The loud thud echoed through the forest, followed by startled shouts from inside. Moments later, the back door creaked open and a man stepped out, glancing around suspiciously. Harold waited until the man was far enough from the cabin, before triggering one of his traps. A log tumbled down from above, startling the man and sending him stumbling backward. Another shout rang out, and two more figures emerged, weapons in hand. From his hiding spot, Harold watched carefully, noting their movements and counting heads. There were 3 of them, armed, but clearly unprepared for resistance. One by one, he lured them farther away from the cabin, using the terrain to his advantage. Each trap worked perfectly, buying him precious seconds to plan his next move. Meanwhile, Ethan stayed hidden nearby, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. Though terrified, he felt a spark of pride watching his grandfather work. Harold might have been older, slower even, but his mind was sharper than ever. He wasn't just surviving, he was fighting back. By the time the third man disappeared into the woods, Harold had positioned himself near the cabin's entrance. With the intruders distracted, he slipped inside unnoticed, determined to uncover the truth once and for all. The inside of the cabin was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and something metallic that made Harold's nose twitch. His eyes adjusted slowly to the gloom, taking in the scene before him. The space was cluttered, crates stacked against one wall, tools scattered across a rickety table, and a small camping stove sitting in the corner. But it wasn't the mess that caught his attention. It was the papers strewn across the table, some weighted down by rocks to keep them from blowing away in the draft. Harold moved cautiously, every step deliberate to avoid making noise. He didn't have much time. He knew the men would realize. They'd been tricked sooner rather than later. Reaching the table, he picked up one of the documents, squinting at the faded handwriting. It was a map, marked with strange symbols and dotted lines leading deep into the woods. Some areas were circled in red, others crossed out entirely. Whatever this operation was, it spanned far beyond just his property. Next to the map lay a ledger, its pages filled with scribbled notes and numbers. Harold flipped through it quickly, his brow furrowing as he pieced together what he was seeing. This wasn't just about chemicals, it was about money. Large sums of cash were recorded next to dates and locations, along with names Harold didn't recognize. These men weren't random criminals. They were part of something bigger, an organized network operating under the radar. A sudden creak outside snapped Harold back to reality. Someone was returning. He glanced around frantically, spotting a tarp-covered lump in the corner. Without hesitation, he pulled it aside, revealing a stash of weapons, rifles, ammunition, and even a few handheld devices he couldn't identify. His stomach churned. Whoever these people were, they weren't just hiding illegal goods. They were preparing for something dangerous. Harold grabbed the map and ledger, stuffing them into his jacket pocket. If he could get this evidence to the authorities, it might be enough to shut them down for good. But first, he needed to get out alive. Just as he turned toward the door, a shadow fell across the threshold. One of the men stood there, silhouetted by the fading light. "What are you doing here, old man?" The intruder growled, his voice low and menacing. In his hand, he held a crowbar, its rusted edges glinting faintly. Harold froze, his mind racing. He couldn't outrun the man, not at his age, and fighting head-on wasn't an option either. Instead, he raised his hands slowly, feigning surrender. "Just looking for answers," he said calmly, his tone steady despite the fear prickling at his spine. "You broke into my house, tore it apart, scared my grandson half to death. I think I deserve to know why." The man smirked, stepping closer. "You don't need to know anything," he sneered. "You should have stayed out of this." Before the man could swing the crowbar, Harold lunged sideways, grabbing a nearby crate and hurling it at him. The distraction worked. The man stumbled backward, giving Harold just enough time to dart past him and bolt out the door. Outside, chaos erupted. The other two men had returned, shouting angrily as they realized their traps had been set off by nothing more than sticks and logs. Harold used the confusion to his advantage, weaving between trees and ducking behind cover. He spotted Ethan, crouched behind a fallen log, flashlight in hand, and signaled for him to stay put. "Get ready to run," Harold called softly, his voice barely audible over the commotion. Then, with a deep breath, he triggered his final trap, a pile of branches rigged to collapse onto anyone who stepped too close. As one of the men charged after him, the ground gave way beneath his feet, sending him tumbling into the dirt. The distraction bought Harold precious seconds. Grabbing Ethan by the arm, he whispered urgently, "Now!" Together, they sprinted deeper into the woods, putting as much distance between themselves and the cabin as possible. Behind them, shouts echoed through the trees, growing fainter with each passing second. They didn't stop until they reached the edge of the forest, where the familiar sight of Harold's battered truck offered a sliver of hope. "We did it," Ethan panted, leaning against the vehicle as he tried to catch his breath. "We got away." Harold nodded, though his expression remained grim. "For now," he said, pulling the map and ledger from his pocket. "But this isn't over yet. Not until we make sure those men can't hurt anyone else." Henry arrived at Victor Kane's estate early in the morning, just as the sun was beginning to rise. The mansion stood tall and imposing, its polished windows reflecting the golden light. It was a place that screamed wealth and power, but Henry wasn't intimidated. He had come prepared. Clutching an old, weathered briefcase tightly in his hand, he walked up the long driveway with determination in his eyes. When he reached the front door, a stern-looking guard blocked his way. "Mr. Kane isn't seeing anyone today," the man said firmly, crossing his arms. Henry didn't argue. Instead, he opened the briefcase slightly, just enough for the guard to see what was inside, a stack of yellowed papers and photographs. The guard hesitated, then quickly stepped aside, muttering something into his radio. Moments later, Henry was escorted into Victor's opulent study. Victor sat behind a massive mahogany desk, sipping coffee from a delicate porcelain cup. His sharp suit and perfectly styled hair made him look every bit the powerful businessman he was. When he saw Henry, his lips curled into a smug smile. "Well, well," Victor drawled, setting the cup down. "Look who decided to show his face after all these years." Henry ignored the jab and placed the briefcase on the desk. He clicked it open, revealing the contents. Inside were documents, contracts, invoices, and photos that detailed shady deals Victor had orchestrated decades ago. Some involved illegal construction projects, others implicated bribery and corruption. Henry leaned forward, his voice calm, but firm. "You sent those men to my house. You scared my grandson. And you think I'm going to let that slide?" Victor laughed, leaning back in his chair. "Oh, Henry, always the sentimental fool. Do you really think waving around some old paper scares me? These are ancient history." Henry shook his head. "Maybe they're old, but they're still dangerous for you. If anything happens to me or my grandson, these documents go straight to the press. Every reporter in the country will have copies by lunchtime. How do you think your shareholders would feel about that?" For the first time, Victor's confident smirk faltered. He stared at Henry, trying to gauge whether he was bluffing, but Henry's steady gaze told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't a desperate threat, it was a calculated move. Victor sighed, running a hand through his slicked back hair. "What do you want, Henry? Money? A quiet retirement somewhere, far away?" "No," Henry replied sharply. "I want you to leave us alone. No more threats, no more games. You forget we ever existed, and I'll keep these where they belong, in this briefcase. Cross me again, and the whole world finds out who you really are." The room fell silent except for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Victor studied Henry for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Fine. You win. But don't mistake this for kindness, Henry. Consider it a business decision." As Henry turned to leave, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He knew Victor wasn't someone to trust completely, but he also knew the man valued his reputation above all else. For now, that was enough. Outside, the fresh air felt crisp and clean, unlike the suffocating atmosphere of Victor's mansion. Henry took a deep breath, clutching the briefcase tightly. He had done what he came to do. Now it was time to focus on rebuilding, not just the house, but the life he shared with Liam. Days turned into weeks, and the farmhouse slowly began to look like home again. Henry worked tirelessly alongside Liam, teaching him how to hammer, nails, sandwood, and paint walls. Each task was a small step toward healing, not just for the house, but for both of them. The boy, who had once been so quiet and withdrawn after the break-in, started to smile more often. There was a sense of pride in his eyes whenever he helped his grandfather finish a project. For Henry, seeing that spark return to Liam's face made all the hard work worth it. One sunny afternoon, as they sat together on the porch eating sandwiches, Liam looked up at Henry with curiosity. "Grandpa, are you scared they'll come back?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. Henry paused, thinking carefully about his answer. He didn't want to lie, but he also didn't want to burden the boy with worry. "No," he finally said, smiling gently. "I did what I had to do to make sure we're safe. And besides, even if they try something, we've got each other. That's stronger than anything." Liam nodded thoughtfully, then grinned. "You're pretty tough, Grandpa." Henry chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. "Well, someone's got to keep this place standing, right?" As the days passed, Henry found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. The confrontation with Victor had forced him to confront parts of his past he'd rather forgotten. But instead of letting those memories weigh him down, he decided to use them as a lesson, for himself and for Liam. He began volunteering at the local community center, sharing stories of resilience and redemption with young people who reminded him of his younger self. Many of them came from difficult backgrounds, and Henry hoped that by opening up about his own struggles, he could inspire them to believe in second chances. Word spread quickly around town about Henry's efforts, and soon, neighbors began stopping by the farmhouse to offer their support. Some brought food, others offered tools or supplies to help with repairs. One elderly woman named Margaret even gifted Liam a set of colorful paints, encouraging him to create art inspired by nature. The kindness of the community touched Henry deeply, reminding him that no matter how isolated life might feel sometimes, there were always good people willing to lend a hand. By the time autumn arrived, the farmhouse was fully restored. Fresh coats of paint brightened the walls, new curtains fluttered in the breeze, and flower beds bloomed vibrantly along the front yard. Inside, shelves lined with books and handmade crafts gave the space a warm, welcoming feel. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a sanctuary filled with love and hope. On one particularly crisp evening, Henry and Liam built a small bonfire in the backyard. They roasted marshmallows, told silly jokes, and gazed up at the stars twinkling above. As the fire crackled softly, Liam leaned against his grandfather, feeling safe and content. "Grandpa," he whispered, "do you think we can stay here forever?" Henry wrapped an arm around the boy, pulling him closer. "As long as you want, kiddo. This is our home now, and no matter what happens, we'll face it together." In that moment, surrounded by the beauty of the night and the comfort of family, Henry realized something profound. Life had thrown its share of challenges his way, but it had also given him moments like this, moments of peace, connection, and renewal. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready to face it head-on, one day at a time. For the first time in years, he felt truly free.